Mike, there you are, sorry, okay. It's Mike Mosley there. All right, moving on then, agenda review. Any additions or changes to the agenda?
No changes, Chair.
All right, public comments. This is an opportunity for public comment for matters not otherwise on today's agenda. Anyone wishing to address the board on a non-agendized item, please step forward. Seeing none, we'll move on then to board member comments. Any comments by board members? No. No? All right, let's move on then to the, we have a consent agenda? We do. We have a consent agenda, just some minutes and an annual report. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Yeah.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Oh, we need a second first, I assume. We need a second. Details. Is there a second?
I wasn't here,
Second.
so I'm not.
There's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Carried. Okay, let's move on then to item number 4, the resolution. Kim, I think that's yours. That was part of the consent agenda.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. I'm Kim Loeb, GMA staff, and it gives me pleasure as chair of the TAG to recognize Tony Morgan for his number of years as a member and vice chair of the technical advisory group, to recognize him with this resolution. Which states that whereas Tony Morgan faithfully served as a member and vice chair of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Technical Advisory Committee between July 30th, 2015 and March 27th, 2018, representing the United Water Conservation District, and whereas Mr. Morgan freely gave of his time, experience, knowledge at the expense of his family and business activities in order to contribute to the success and accomplishments of the agency. And whereas Mr. Morgan played a key role in developing groundwater sustainability plans for 4 groundwater basins under the agency's jurisdiction, which when completed will ensure sustainable groundwater management of the basins as required by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And whereas Mr. Morgan has been an influential, positive voice in a collaborative process promoting cooperation amongst the many water factions. And whereas during his tenure, Mr. Morgan served with distinction and provided significant technical contributions to developments of the plans for the future sustainable groundwater management of the basins within the jurisdiction of the Fox Canyon Management Agency. Therefore, it's resolved that your board recognizes Tony Morgan on this day for his service.
Thank you, Tony. Why don't you join me here at the podium? Present that to you on behalf of the board and staff. We want to thank you for all of your contributions, and we'll expect more for the work of the agency. You should. You bet. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If I could address the board for just a second, thank you very much for the resolution. It was unanticipated but much appreciated. And I look forward to continuing to assist this agency and its stakeholders as we all move towards trying to figure out how we're going to achieve our groundwater sustainability. Thanks again.
Thank you. Procedure, that was item 3 on the agenda, not 4. 4 is the next in order. Transfer of well ownership.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. For the record, Kim Loeb again, GMA staff. So this item's regarding a well in Oxnard that's on the Grace Bible Church property at 936 West 5th Street. The well was installed in 1929, partly drilled to 400 feet and reportedly perforated between 105 and 220. It was operated by Garcia Greens, DBA CNF Flowers from 2000 to 2015, an operator failed to submit and file their extraction statements since 2012 or pay extraction fees since 2011. This agency took legal action against the operator, the overlying landowner, and other parties. The litigation was resolved with your board approval, and the agency requested and received quitclaim deeds from the church and property owner, and there was another potential owner that was identified through title searches, and we recently received a quitclaim deed from that individual as well. So now all potential well owners have provided quitclaim deeds to the agency. However, the agency has not recorded those quitclaim deeds, and so comes to you today, staff comes to you today with some options for what your board wants to do with this well. So the well is, see if I remember how to use this mouse thing. Guess not. Anyway, that's weird. Oh, there it is. All right. So here is 5th Street, and here is Hobson Way, and this is the old Oxnard High School, and right here is the airport. So here's the church, the well is right there, and there's an underground pipeline that leads to this field, 11-acre field, and that's what was being watered, at least in recent years, by that well. Here's a close-up view of the church and the well, pump house in the yellow circle, and this is what it looks like from 5th Street, the pump house there in the yellow circle, and that's looking inside the pump house at the pump and motor on the pump. So in terms of the well production history of this well, the county records are not very complete, as you might imagine, since this was installed in 29. We don't have a record of the well construction details. However, in 1978, there was information indicated the well produced 1,500 GPM at that time. The well had a historical allocation of a little over 49 acre feet at the beginning of GMA time. Extractions were reported at exactly 30 feet from 2002 to 2010, which is a little suspicious. But starting in 2011, the extractions reported were 80.88 acre feet, and then 33.89 in 2012. And then, as mentioned earlier, there were no extractions reported in, or they weren't reported in 13, 14, and 15, and the well has been inactive since 2015. So some possible options for the well should the agency choose to assert its ownership over the well. First is could destroy the well, abandon the pipeline, and remove the pump house. Alternatively, the agency could use the well as a monitoring well. Since the well integrity and construction details aren't known, we would recommend removing the pump and videoing the well to determine exactly the screened interval. And if the well is dedicated as a monitoring well, it would make sense to remove that pump house and modify the wellhead and possibly abandon the pipeline. The agency could maintain the well and lease it for irrigation on that property over there by the airport, or potentially maintain the well and sell the allocation on the water market. However, it's not clear that the well would have any allocation, depending on what the allocation system ultimately is selected. Because no reporting was done since 2012, in the current water market pilot, which is based on 14-15 reporting, that it would have no allocation. Alternatively, your board might decide not to assert ownership because it could incur potential liability. There'll be some expense, especially if it's converted to a monitoring well or if it was destroyed. It could require additional insurance depending on the use of the well. And the agency could look to another entity to assume ownership if they were interested in doing so, such as the County of Ventura, the Watershed Protection District, or the City of Oxnard. City of Oxnard has expressed interest in using this well as a monitoring well for its nearby ASR facilities it plans to fire up soon, especially if the well is perforated where we think it is, which would put it in the Oxnard aquifer. We don't have any other wells in the area that are specifically monitoring that aquifer. So staff would recommend maintaining the well as a monitoring well one way or the other, either by asserting ownership, agency's ownership, and keeping it for agency under agency ownership, or looking to see if another agency is willing to assume ownership of the well. The agency has owned monitoring wells in the past, not irrigation wells, but monitoring wells, and moving forward, there's quite a few monitoring wells that are tentatively being looked at in the groundwater sustainability plans to fill data gaps, so owning of monitoring wells would not be a new or different thing from the past or future. So that concludes my
Any questions from the board?
Yeah,
Comments?
Mr. Chair, the Airport Authority owns a property there east or south of Ventura Road, and we used to grow flowers there before, Airport Authority, but there's no longer water available for that site. And I don't think the Airport Authority wants to do anything with that property because it's right on the path of the landing for the aircraft. So if, are they still capable of delivering water there to that section?
Well, we presume it's still capable. It was as of, I think, either 2014 or early 2015 irrigating that field, and nothing's changed, presuming that the pump is still operational. We have no reason to believe it isn't. The pipeline still exists, so that is still a feasible possibility, yes.
Because I've asked Todd, Todd is the manager of the Airport Authority, and he says that currently we're just not going to plan to do anything there. With it. Just keep it mowed down and clean, for the Airport Authority to keep it out of the path of anything out of the path of the flight.
Right.
So.
Any questions or comments from the board?
One question. You talk about the use of the monitoring well. Do we need a monitoring well there?
Especially if it is perforated where we think it's perforated, the way the county records, the old county records indicate, that would put it in the Oxnard aquifer. We don't have wells in that area that are specifically perforated in the Oxnard aquifer, so it would be a useful monitoring well location. As I mentioned, City of Oxnard's consultant has indicated that they're very interested in monitoring that interval as well associated with their ASR activities. So it would provide useful monitoring information that we don't have presently.
Can you go back to your first slide there with showing the overhead of whereabouts this is in relation to the airport and everything else? There you go. If I understand correctly, directly across the street, across 5th Street there, is whereabouts Oxnard is doing their ASR facility for their advanced water purification.
Correct.
Is that correct, Tian?
Yeah.
Okay. So since it's in such an ideal location for whereabouts they're going to be doing their ASR facility, has the city expressed any interest in taking that well over and putting it as part of their monitoring plan, as that's where they're going to be injecting it?
We have not approached the city about taking ownership of the well. They have expressed ownership in monitoring it. If that's the direction your board wants us to explore, we can certainly explore that possibility with the city. That's one of the options that we're asking you to consider for direction.
That's my preferred, but I'm only one.
You said it would be beneficial for Fox Canyon to take over the well. Would it be more beneficial and share that information with Oxnard if we kept it?
Or the alternative might be to
alternative.
have Oxnard take it over, have
Share it
Oxnard
vice
pay to
versa.
rehab it, and have Oxnard provide us with the data.
Right.
Well, either
I
or.
would say, well, staff believes that it is advantageous to maintain the well for
For us to-
monitoring purposes. Whether we monitor it or City of Oxnard monitors it, the data would be shared. We don't have a preference either way.
But maintain it for monitoring now.
That would be our recommendation.
Okay.
There would be some expense incurred in doing that because, well, we would recommend removing that pump house and modifying the wellhead, and let's say removing the pump and videoing the well.
Before we narrow the choices, if there are no other questions from the board, let me ask any questions or comments from the public. All right, hearing none, then, my preference would be, I don't want to see us in the operations business. We're not staffed for it, and we're not funded for it at this point. So I think staff would be well advised to confer further with Oxnard and to see, whether they're interested in taking title to this and rehabbing it, operating it as a monitoring well so that the agency can obtain the information they need in that aquifer.
Well, it says Oxnard has approached us about it.
I guess they approached us about using it as a monitoring
Using
well.
it.
I don't know if they wanted title or not and what goes with that.
Correct.
Anybody from Oxnard want to step up and tell us? Not that we would put you on the spot, but would you want to take title of this?
Good afternoon, Chair West, board members. Oxnard will entertain either way.
Okay, thank you.
So
I guess that would be my recommendation. Anybody have a
Robert,
different
have a
thought?
motion?
Sounds like a motion.
I'll make that as a motion.
I would second.
All right. All in favor? I need a roll call, I guess, for this property.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, moving on now to item number 5. Annual report cards. I know my grandkids hate this time of year, but it's,
Good afternoon, Chairman West and directors. For the record, my name is Kathleen Rydell. I'm here to present item 5, the 2017 Agency Annual Basin Management Objectives Report Cards and Fall 2017 Groundwater Levels. And if I could get my slides. Let's see. How does this work? Which one?
Use the big one to go forward, but just click it, don't hold it. And then if you want the cursor, hold that one down for a bit and the cursor, and if you need to go back, use that one.
maybe.
It worked over there.
Sometimes it'll, she said follow the lady, there it goes. Sometimes it'll lock up.
Well,
Good report.
this is to provide your board with the status report on groundwater conditions and how the agency is doing in meeting the management objectives. And the tools selected for that is the Basin Management Objective Report Cards and water level maps. You should have in possession of water level maps, color copies should have been provided to you, as well as large color copies of the Basin Management Objective Report Cards. Okay. To provide context for this presentation, I've prepared a table, and the Basin Management Objective Report Cards talk about 5-year trends. So on the table, I've provided the last 5 years before including 2017, which would be 2013, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And 2017 follows 6 years of drought, which was 2011 through 2016. So that was below average rainfall. The 2017 numbers are on the table, and it's in the far right-hand side in bold. Annual rainfall was above average, with average being 13.78 inches. That was the average for the agency between 1985 and 2017. And extractions reported as of May 18th, 2018 were 132,400 acre feet, roughly. And that was with 9.5% non-reporting. So there's still a lot of reports still to come in, to put that into context. And then when you're looking at the East Las Posas water levels, realize that Calleguas Municipal Water District injected 2,538 acre feet more than they extracted from the basin. So that just sort of puts it in context as you look at the water levels and when you look at the BMO report cards. So starting out with the water level maps, those were prepared as prepared in the past. We started in 2013 providing the 1972 to 2012 even year potentiometric surface maps for the upper and lower aquifer systems, and that is for the fall only. And we followed that same format style, the board's direction on that. The maps were prepared for the upper aquifer system as well as the lower aquifer system. The water level data was collected from other sources. We don't do our own monitoring. We receive it from the County of Ventura, from United Water Conservation District, Calleguas Municipal Water District, Zone Mutual, and many others. So we receive the data. Our contouring is 20-foot intervals, and we colorize between the contours with yellows, oranges, and reds being below sea level, and greens and blues being above sea level. We have a QA/QC process. We did send it out to members of the original technical group who reviewed the maps back in 2013. And we did receive comments back, and the maps were edited prior to being incorporated into the agenda packet. And then this map, the 2017 draft maps, once your board receives and files them, will be considered part of the series of maps that has been prepared previously. This is the draft fall 2017 potentiometric surface maps for the upper aquifer system. And if you compare that to the 2016, water levels in some areas are the same. Some areas they rose, and a few areas they declined. But overall, they stayed the same or rose in the upper aquifer system. So for perspective, here is the 1990 fall upper aquifer system map. That is the end of the last significant drought. These are commonly usually represent the historic lows that we see when we compare things to the historic low water levels. So going back for the 5-year trends, this is 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and this is 2017. So you can see when comparing 16 to 17, you can see that water levels did rise. And then for the fall of 2017, this is the lower aquifer system potentiometric surface map. And for comparison to the 1990 map. And then moving forward from 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017. So that puts into context as we go now through the Basin Management Objective Report Cards. The BMO's Basin Management Objectives were established in the 2007 update to the Groundwater Management Plan. There are 26 locations that are being monitored. Some of those are nested well locations, so it may be at the same location, but we're monitoring different aquifers at that location. So there are 26 locations, and at each location there are 2 basin management objectives being monitored, either water level or water quality or 2 water quality levels. So there is a total of 52 basin management objectives. The goals of the objectives are to protect water quality for beneficial uses, prevent saline intrusion, and protect public water wells from nitrate. And they serve as a quantitative metric for evaluating the effectiveness of management strategies. So in the 4 bay, the objectives are nitrate and total dissolved solids, Oxnard Plain and Pleasant Valley, it is water levels and chloride concentrations. Arroyo Santa Rosa is chloride and nitrate. And in the Las Posas Valley, it's chloride and total dissolved solids. In summary, for the basin management objectives, none of the water level objectives were met in 2017. Chloride, 11 were not met out of the 24 objectives, and note that 3 objectives we did not have data for. Those 3 wells were not monitored in 2017, so that means that there's a total of 6 out of the 52 that weren't monitored. Nitrates, 2 were not met, and then in total dissolved solids, 3 were met, 3 were not met, and we didn't have data for 2 of the basin management objectives. So this is on the screen is an example of a basin management objective report card. And then drilling in, it provides at the top of the card the basin that it applies to. It provides the goals for that basin. It provides the basin management objectives. It provides a written status summary. It provides a summary status table and a map showing where the BMO wells are located. And then there's a time series data plot provided for the data. And this is just representative of looking for the 5-year trends. Lines going from left to right, upward slant, that's increasing. So that is, on this particular graph, it's increasing total dissolved solids and increasing nitrates for that example. And then the lower plot, you can see also the lines are going upward to the right, and therefore they're increasing. On the blue line, it's water levels, and you can see that the slope from left to right is going downward, and that's a decreasing water level. And then the example at the bottom, the gold line there, showing it's stable, there's not much change. And then also referred to, if it's fluctuating within a range during that 5-year period, it's considered the same as being stable or no change. So running through by objective types, as stated, none of the water level BMOs are being met. So the red dots represent not being met. When you see green dots, so once again, lower aquifer system, Oxnard Plain, none of the basin management objectives for water levels are being met. In the Pleasant Valley Basin, neither one of the basin management objectives for water levels is being met. This is for chloride. Chlorides are being met in the northern portion of the basin. And where you see 2 color codes on the same dot, the upper portion of the upper zone that is being monitored, the basin management objective is not being met. And the lower zone at that location, it is being met. And added are concentrations next to wells that are the highest. So the 2 highest, the one at Point Magoo, 18,550 milligrams per liter chloride, is very close to seawater. And then this is for the lower aquifer system, Oxnard Plain, and you can see that the northern 2 dots are meeting the basin management objectives. However, at Port Hueneme and Point Magoo area, the objectives are not being met. Chlorides in the Pleasant Valley Basin, the objectives are being met. In the Arroyo Santa Rosa Basin, one of the wells we did not receive data for, and the one that we did, which is on the east side, it's very close to that basin management objective. It met it, but it's coded as yellow as caution. It's approaching that objective. In the Las Posas Valley, we did not have data for 2 of the wells. And then you can see in the West Las Posas, they are meeting the basin management objectives for chloride, but in the East Las Posas, they are not. Nitrate basin management objectives are not being met in the forebay. And the Arroyo Santa Rosa Basin, nitrate concentrations are being met at the well to the east, and no data for the one on the west side of the Arroyo Santa Rosa. Forebay, one of the wells is meeting the total dissolved solids basin management objective, however, one is not. And then for total dissolved solids in the Las Posas Valley, the basin management objectives are being met in the West Las Posas, but not in the East Las Posas. And once again, no data was available for the well in the South Las Posas and the East Las Posas on the far east side. So in summary, comparing 2017 to the previous years, 2012 through 2017, that's what is being graphed here, and 32 basin management objectives were not met, 14 were met, and we had no data for 6. In the future, once the groundwater sustainability plans goes forward, we will be monitoring and keeping track of aquifer-specific water levels instead of upper aquifer system, lower aquifer system, so we should have those maps available. And we'll be looking more towards measurable objectives and monitoring water quality, and we'll transition from what's dictated in the 2007 groundwater management plan and going forward with the groundwater sustainability plan. And are there any questions?
Questions from the board? None here. Questions from the general public? Hearing none, thank you. This is a receive and file. I guess we just need a motion to receive and file the report. And a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Kathleen. Moving on now to item number 6. GSP update. Kim, I think this was yours, was it not? It's got your name on it.
It does, Chair West. However, this is your monthly update on the groundwater sustainability plans. We have the DUDEC team here today, our GSP consultant, and Jill Weimer will provide the update to your board.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Jill Weinberger. And as Kim said, I am here to provide the update on the GSP development process. And you can kind of think of this as the next step after the board workshops that we held a couple months ago. At the end of those workshops, we were in the middle of receiving comments from stakeholders. And that comment period closed, and in the meantime, we have been then reviewing the comments, documenting the comments, processing the comments. And so what I'm going to present today is a summary of those comments, and particularly focused on ones that would require some board direction when the comments came out. And so I want to assure stakeholders in the audience and who may watch that we have read all of the letters, we have processed all of the comments, we've documented all of the comments, but the purpose of today's summary is not actually to get into detail on everything, but rather to focus on a few that we're bringing back to the board. Having said that, as this development process continues, there may be additional comments that we identify in the future that could come back to the board. I don't want to exclude anything now, but these are the ones we've identified thus far. So now I get the challenge of making this work. This is sort of the framework on this slide for the presentation, which is to go through our projected timeline, still lacking dates at this point, for the GSP process. And this is a busy slide, so I'm going to take you through it for just a second here. The upper part of the slide is looking at where there are some key board decision points. Those are not today, but that first board decision point we would see happening at the June meeting. So the issues that I'm going to bring up today, we would like some direction on from the June meeting. At the same time, we are here presenting the summarized feedback. Between now and that June meeting, we will be working on developing a timeline. That is certainly something that came up in a number of the comments as well. We'll be working with staff on that to come back with a firmer timeline. The second, so here's our first decision point in June. Somewhere shortly thereafter, we're going to need another decision point, and that's really targeted at projects. I know those are working their way through the board operations committee, and we're going to need some directions on that before we can launch into the technical work down here on looking at the future scenarios and doing that modeling work. This has a long time frame and a couple arrows pointing to it. At those board workshops, we talked about this being an iterative process. So we're going to be working on those models and coming back to you with updates as we work through them and potentially requesting additional direction as needed moving forward. At that point, we're going to have some more decisions to make, primarily focused on what's significant and unreasonable to develop our minimum thresholds. After we've gone through that process, we will prepare the revised draft GSP. And that last decision point is going to be the board's releasing the GSP for public comment again. And so I'm going to work through all of this and start to add to what is relatively empty on the upper part of that slide. It will not stay that way for long. So our first step after we reviewed all of the letters and documented the comments was to prepare some comment themes and understand the general themes that were being discussed in the stakeholder feedback. And so these are the 10 themes that came out of that review process. The first 3 are really very centered on the board and its process. So some policy concerns that were brought up by stakeholders. Staff is aware of those, and we're working through those. Which ones will need to come to you, that'll be developed moving in the future. The GSP process was a concern to stakeholders, and I'll get into that in the next slide. Projects, we've already talked about. I'm not going to dive into that because that's got a process moving forward. There was a discussion of the interagency and interbasin coordination and how that was addressed in the GSP. Allocations, again, I'm not going to get into allocations today. That's got its own process that's moving forward. Eventually that allocation plan will be incorporated into the GSP, but it wasn't in the preliminary draft, and that's because it's got its separate timeline and process. Discussion of the general minimum thresholds, the approach, and what they were. There was also concern for specific stakeholders based on the actual minimum thresholds that were proposed in the preliminary draft. Concerns about the water budget, and those were primarily technical in nature. They're not going to require board direction, so we won't go into those today. Monitoring networks, and then sustainability indicators. And the 3 sustainability indicators that really came out with a lot of stakeholder feedback were seawater intrusion, groundwater quality, and groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So if I focus in now on that process, a number of the comments that were directed at the GSP process were really looking at a request of understanding how the revised draft would be examined moving forward. So right now, there were requests that there be additional review of the draft moving forward. So right now, the scope, what's in the currently anticipated scope, is that section 2.4.5, which was not written, nobody has seen it yet, and that's the future water balance. That will obviously be released for review. Chapters 3, the sustainable management criteria, will be revised based on the future groundwater modeling that will be done. Chapter 4 may be revised based on the results of that modeling as well. And Chapter 5, the projects and management actions. So those are what we would anticipate and is under the current scope to be released for additional review by the stakeholders. If there is board direction to release the entire draft, meaning including chapters 1 and 2, that would be out of scope, and we would need your direction on that moving forward. In order to accommodate that request and understand our scope moving forward, we would request that you consider that and give us direction at that first decision point in June.
Pardon me,
sorry.
Jill. Pardon me.
Yeah,
The letters that requested complete release of the entire document, not just unreleased and revised portions. What did they indicate? They wanted to see the entire thing in one piece, or
yeah, so I should be clear that there were 12 letters that we sort of put in this category. I think not every one of those letters said specifically, we want to see chapters 1 through 5 as an entire document, and we're very clear about it. The requests of those 12 letters were, we want to see this document again. And they weren't necessarily specific to, we only want to see what hasn't been released. There were at least 2, and I'm trying to think if there were any more, who did specifically say, we reserve the right to comment on the entire draft as it comes out again, or we would like to have the right to comment on the entire draft. And I'm not the stakeholder. I will attempt to provide their feedback, but I'm sure there will be public comment after this, that I think the reasoning there is that they would like to see how the document functions as a whole, and that it's not as easy to do that if they're just reviewing pieces along the way.
makes sense. Thank you.
The other thing that I should point out on this slide is that there is this decision point 2 where we're going to have to come to talk about projects. I don't have a project slide. You guys are working on that, but that's kind of the next step after this, and I didn't know where else to throw that in and remind people. The next comment theme that came up was a discussion of interbasin and interagency coordination. And this had a wide range of comments, including ensuring that the GSP coordinated with the general plan and other planning documents, which is part of SIGMA, and that has to be incorporated into the GSP. What I'm going to focus on, what another series of these kinds of comments focused on, is addressing seawater intrusion. And we've talked about it at the board workshop, and I'm just going to bring it up again, that currently the GSPs are written in a way that only the Oxnard Basin has specific water level minimum thresholds targeted at seawater intrusion, because we don't see physical seawater moving into the Pleasant Valley or the West Las Posas basins. Having said that, SIGMA certainly requires that the Pleasant Valley and West Las Posas basins set their minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in a way that Oxnard can still meet its measurable objectives and minimum thresholds. And this agency oversees all the basins. And so if we're talking about having coordination agreements between basins, it's a coordination agreement between Fox Canyon and Fox Canyon in large part. So currently it's set up in a way that seawater intrusion is only, the minimum threshold is only set for seawater intrusion in the Oxnard Basin. If the board would like to provide direction that we need to set specific water level targets in Pleasant Valley and West Las Posas for seawater intrusion, we can do that. That will require rewriting the document. I don't think that's required under SIGMA. I think what's required is ensuring that all the basins work together to make sure nobody's impacted. But I know that there was some interest in that, and that came up again in the stakeholder letters. And feel free to interrupt me and ask questions along the way. So if we want to talk about changing the approach to discussing seawater intrusion in these documents, that again has to be done sooner rather than later. So that would be at this first board decision point in June. Related to seawater intrusion, we started talking about minimum thresholds set in Oxnard versus the other basins. There were a lot of comments on general minimum thresholds that were set in the preliminary draft GSPs. And a number of the commenters requested an expanded discussion of those, how we reached those thresholds. We certainly agree with those comments. We will be providing an expanded discussion. And that expanded discussion is really going to come out. It's our current vision for where that will come from is the future water budget and the modeling work that is ongoing right now. Because that's where we're going to be able to unify what's happening in the basins under this groundwater model and look at water levels and the impacts of different pumping scenarios on those water levels. And I think that moving forward, we will be presenting specific impacts to the board for input on what's significant and unreasonable. And as a part of that, that will involve sort of a discussion of trade-offs. And you know, if we use this water level, this is what it means for the sustainable yield, but this is how it might impact specific stakeholders. And those kinds of discussions will be brought forward to the board for consideration. That discussion, because it's based in large part on the modeling, that's going to happen to some degree during this modeling update and direct how the modeling proceeds, but it'll also primarily happen at this board decision point 3, where you're really going to be looking at what are the undesirable results in these basins. The next issue that was brought up, again relating to minimum thresholds, this was fairly specific, talking about using water levels as a proxy for other sustainability indicators. So there was a lot of concern expressed about using water levels, which are really what we rely on most heavily in the preliminary draft GSPs for all the sustainability indicators. That approach was developed with TAG because the water levels, as you saw actually with the BMO report cards just a minute ago, the water levels are what we call a leading indicator. So, for instance, in the Oxnard Basin, as you drop water levels through increased pumping, that's a far more instantaneous, it doesn't happen instantly, but it's a far more rapid response. You pump more, water levels go down. You then increase the gradient from the ocean, and it takes a while for physical seawater to move into the basin as a response to that gradient change. So if you measure the water level, all of a sudden you know now you're starting that process. If you're measuring instead chloride concentration, it can take a while before you start to see the chloride concentration go up as the seawater slowly approaches. So this approach of using water levels was definitely developed in conjunction with TAG. It was vetted by TAG, and it's specifically allowed for under SGMA. So SGMA has language that says an agency may establish a representative minimum threshold for groundwater elevation, so a water level, that would serve as the value for multiple sustainability indicators where you can show that there's a relationship. So we think this is a sound approach, but it was certainly something that was brought up by a number of stakeholders. And so if there is direction from the board to look specifically at other sustainability indicators like chloride concentrations for seawater, then we need to have that discussion, and the board would have to give us that direction again at that June decision point. The next discussion of minimum thresholds and concern about minimum threshold, I would say, it certainly generated a lot of discussion and stakeholders, and that's the discussion of water quality. And we've had some of those discussions here already at the board workshops and how water quality was approached. And I should say, for clarity, this is water quality independent of seawater intrusion. So this is, seawater intrusion is its own separate indicator under SGMA. This is now just water quality. So this is looking at things like nitrates in the forebay, the concentrations of TDS and chloride in East Las Posas, those sorts of concerns for water quality. There were several letters that were addressing the minimum thresholds for water quality, or in this case, the fact that in the GSPs, there are no specific concentration minimum thresholds for water quality. The water quality minimum thresholds would be more like the aspirational goals currently envisioned in the GSP, and that is certainly allowed under Sigma. But through our discussions with DWR, I do think that the discussion of the efforts that are currently undertaken in the basin to improve water quality and address water quality would need to be better fleshed out in the GSP than it is in the preliminary draft. So adopting a specific concentration threshold for water quality is a thorny issue. And the reason it's a thorny issue is that you would be setting minimum thresholds, which would be something that DWR would regulate the basins by, for water quality that's not changes in water quality that are not caused by groundwater pumping and cannot be mitigated solely by the management of groundwater pumping. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying it's an issue to be wrestled with if you choose to move forward with that. And it doesn't, by not doing specific minimum thresholds, it doesn't prevent you from participating in those efforts to address water quality in other ways, right? And it also doesn't prevent you from setting aspirational goals for water quality. And so the language in Sigma under that is that an agency may establish measurable objectives that exceed the reasonable margin of operational flexibility. So in this case, that would be your current water quality, more or less, or the range that you've seen. So you can set a measurable objective to improve the water quality for the purpose of improving overall conditions in the basin, but failure to achieve that will not be grounds for a finding of inadequacy of the plan. And I will say to that, we don't have those in the plan yet. So those are not in the plan currently. And the last concern about water quality that was raised was related to how the plan interacts with other plans, and in particular salt nutrient management plans and the TMDLs that are currently in existence for the basins. These are not necessarily directly connected to board decisions for you. I'm bringing them forward because they were certainly a concern that were expressed in many of the letters. But how these are incorporated will depend on this issue of whether or not to adopt specific concentration thresholds under the plan. So that falls into two categories. One is a discussion of planning goals, which would be at the first decision point, and then ultimately a discussion of what the undesirable results are, depending on what the board decides on adopting water quality minimum thresholds. The third sustainability indicator that certainly engendered a lot of comments were the groundwater dependent ecosystems. And in some cases, there were certainly comments that were requesting things that are outside the realm of Sigma. So some of the comments requested effectively that the GSP weigh in on regulations of surface flow in the Santa Clara River, and that's not what Sigma is, it's not what the GSP can do. There were requests to assess impacts to non-adjacent basins, and again, that's really outside the realm of what this process is. But there were also several requests that were well within the realm of Sigma, and those include what would be, again, more of a goal for the board to discuss, which is to include specifically in-stream beneficial uses of surface water in a sustainability goal. That's not a specific sustainability goal right now. The sustainability goals were based on the goals that the board adopted, I think, in 2015. And so it's that specific language that the board would be asked to address here. There were also requests for additional characterization of the groundwater surface water interaction. I think moving forward on that, we need to keep in mind the difference between the data we have currently and what we anticipate gathering over the next 5 years and providing in the 5-year update. And so we've done quite a bit with the data that we have. There's not a whole lot more data massage that we can do to address that groundwater surface water interaction currently, but there are monitoring protocols and programs proposed in the subsequent chapters to address that moving forward. And DWR doesn't require or expect everyone to have all of the data right now to have these basins perfectly characterized. And then there were several requests to ensure that GDEs are accounted for in the sustainable yield, and that absolutely has to happen. That's anticipated under SGMA. That's something that we will do. But again, currently as it's written, we're doing that using groundwater levels, not looking at plant health or anything else. It's a groundwater level proxy indicator. So for that, again, there's this discussion of planning goals. Are you going to address specific surface water, specific in-stream beneficial uses in the planning goals? And then after the modeling work, or as part of the modeling work, look at the undesirable results, and GDEs will be part of that examination. I've talked a lot about the modeling efforts, so we know that those are moving forward. There are numerical models that are prepared by United and Kayagis, and those are going to be used to simulate the sustainable yield for the Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, and Las Posas Valley basins. And those agencies have been very helpful, and they've been sharing their updates with the TAG, and they've been documenting their models, and we really appreciate that. That's been very helpful for us. There has also been a discussion of whether or not the board would like to undertake an independent peer review of the models that would be specifically targeted at the GSP development process, because these models were not necessarily specifically developed for the GSPs. That independent peer review would look at the consistency of the models with the conceptual models that were produced for the GSP, look at the parameter sensitivity in the models, and address uncertainty in the sustainable yield in these models. And uncertainty is a required part, an assessment of uncertainty is a required part of SGMA. So,
Jill, is that somewhere on the decision timeline where we have to make a...
That I believe is in June here. Okay. That is out of scope work, so that has not been scoped at this point in time. So that would be something for you to decide on. And then, as I promised at the beginning, I did want to get to how we're planning on addressing the comments, since this is not an exhaustive discussion of every comment. It may feel like it, but it's not. Right now, this is an example of a page that we've put together, specific in this case to general minimum threshold comments, and we've got comments on there such as clarify the criteria used to select wells and elevations for minimum thresholds, and we've then listed the number of letters and who had a comment relating to that, which specific letters had a comment relating to that. And so that will be addressed in the GSP, and the stakeholder or the reader will be directed in an appendix tied to this table. So this table will be in an appendix along with a direction of and an explanation of how that was addressed in the GSP. So that's our response to comments. And this will be done by basin. So this is not a generic appendix. This is specific to comments for the Las Posas, comments for the Oxnard, comments for the Pleasant Valley basins. And when you put everything together, as I promised, that top half of the slide gets a little bit busier. So what we would see moving forward for the June meeting is a discussion, if the board is going to entertain this, of how the process will be done for releasing a revised draft of the GSP. That could involve some out-of-scope work. there are planning goals, so this discussion of in-stream beneficial uses. I think there was also a planning goal for seawater intrusion. So the discussion of planning goals will need to be decided on then. Again, the approach for seawater intrusion, is it okay to have just the targets for Oxnard and then have interbasin coordination agreements, or do we want to set specific targets in the other basins? That gets to the interbasin interagency coordination. Water levels is a proxy indicator. Again, we feel that that's a sound approach under SGMA, but if the board would like to address that, they can weigh in on that. Independent model review, and that was the last slide I talked about. In the meantime, we're developing the timeline, we're moving forward. There's a lot of discussion ongoing with TAG with the model approach and moving forward on that. Projects will be incorporated, modeling will be done, and eventually we're going to get to this part where we're preparing a revised draft GSP, incorporating the comments, and then the board will be releasing that for public review. And then the final will be prepared and submitted to DWR.
Jill, go back to that slide if you would. Go ahead, Dave.
You go ahead, Chair, you first.
When, with respect to the first and last items on the board decision point 1, where we're talking about additional scope, will we actually have a scope of work and some cost estimates, a revised scope of work and cost estimates to review for both of those items by the June meeting?
We can provide that, yes.
Jill, my question would be that you did a great job of summarizing all these things in decision point 1. It would be really nice to have that written up for the board.
Oh, sure.
Each point, each bullet point with an explanation underneath of
Sure.
those sub-items in that, each decision.
Sure.
Ideally, more than 3 days ahead of the next meeting.
That's not enough time?
Any other questions? I'm sorry, were you done with your presentation? Jill?
Well, I have the conclusion slide, so we're close.
Not
We're almost
quite.
there, huh? Okay. I don't want to jump on your conclusion.
No. So just in summary, the releasing the preliminary draft GSPs was very helpful. We elicited a lot of very useful stakeholder feedback, and we're very appreciative to all the stakeholders that put in the time to send in letters. It's been very helpful for us. And that will be incorporated, that feedback will be incorporated into the GSPs. We'll return in June with the timeline. It sounds like we're also returning in June with scope for you to review, and before June, the scope you would like in the board package before June. I'll have to talk to Kim. I don't know how the inner workings happen. And then a summary of the presentation today before you'd have to weigh in on those discussions in
The
June.
trouble is that sometimes we get pretty large packets a few days ahead, and then some of them quite weighty technical things that we might like to talk to our TAG representatives about, other things, and so.
Absolutely, yeah. And then for you, there is that decision point 1 in the June meeting, and those subsequent decision points I can't put a specific timeline on, and they're going to depend on a number of factors and how the modeling goes and the rest of it. So that's it from me.
Any other questions or comments from the board? No? Questions or comments from the public?
Susan Mulligan, Cayugas Municipal Water District. You mentioned that you were going to respond to the comments in terms of themes. We had some very specific comments, particularly related to our ASR well operation and objectives to protect the use of that facility. I'm not sure if that would be addressed in a general theme type comment. There may be others who also have some very specific comments that they put in that might not be addressed by that theme approach. So I just wanted to go on record and say that there might be cases where the theme approach doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan, before you sit down, I don't know if Cayugas was one of the commenters, but what is Cayugas' thought on the second review being the complete GSP or just unreleased revised pieces of?
We feel it's important that stakeholders have an opportunity to look at the entire plan in its entirety and comment
Together
on it.
as one.
All together as one, yes.
Okay.
And there were, some of what was produced before wasn't complete anyway.
Okay.
But yes, we think it should be considered all together.
Any other questions or comments from the public?
Terry Foreman, I'm a member of the TAG committee, and appreciate the overview on this. I guess I'm a little concerned about what we're talking about as schedule here with the GSPs that were produced were pretty preliminary, and I would say very draft, very preliminary. And in the material that was produced, just example for the water budget and the sustainability, there's just flaws in them and major inconsistencies to the point where in one section of the GSPs it says the basin is in balance, and in another section of the GSP it says the basin is out of balance. So we haven't even resolved what the condition of the basin is, and it would seem that in order to move forward we at least need to get to a point where we have some general consensus about what the status of the basin is, what is the historical budget of the basin, so that it's one or the other. It can't be both. It can't be out of balance and it can't be in balance at the same time. And right now, the GSPs essentially say that in some basins. So I think to move forward, you're going to need to know what does it take to get to that. Now, hopefully, we're going to have a better understanding of some of that as the models are finalized. And I know that there's a couple of meetings, or at least one meeting this month, on the United model to get some final input on where that stands. And I think that the goal would be to get that to completion, to get that to where everyone agrees that it's a representative model as best we can understand it now. And that's not going to happen until June 19th or 14th, one of those dates. So I don't know how we can come back, next month and say that we're going to be able to move forward, because we're still making decisions about what is the status of the basin. There's a lot of details in those GSPs that just aren't resolved yet. We don't have an understanding. So I think that needs to get resolved. And so the court, in response to Director's Borchard comment about wanting to review the whole document, we absolutely need to review the whole document because of those inconsistencies and flaws that are in the previous write-ups. So that needs to be done. Secondly, I think it's going to take some time to deal with that issue that was brought up regarding the inter-basin issues. And I brought this up at one of the previous meetings. For example, in the Pleasant Valley Basin, if you look at the GSP, in general, it hinted that the basin was in balance. Well, what does that say about the Oxnard Basin? Does that mean that the Pleasant Valley Basin needs to provide more flow to the Oxnard Basin? Because according to the water balance, the Pleasant Valley Basin was in balance, but the GSP said it was out of balance by 10,000 acre feet. So those are the kind of inconsistencies I'm talking about. But ultimately, we'll get to the how does the pain get shared. I think Jill did a good job of indicating that there will be interactions between these basins, and I think it's going to require a lot of policy discussion and some technical iterations to figure out how the basin should share the pain in order, how much flow should be going from basin A to basin B. And that's going to require, I think, a lot of discussion. I'm sure the stakeholders are going to have a lot of interest in that. So that's going to have to be an issue to be addressed. And then all these other issues that Jill talked about, I guess I see that it would seem to me that some of these issues would have to be discussed and fleshed out before, and some direction and decision given back before we could come back with a scope, we being the technical folks, to come back with a scope that says this is what it's going to take, because I don't think we know yet. I think there's still a lot of these issues. How are they going to get addressed, and what are you going to require additional work to be done in order to address these items? So while they can bring back some scopes, I don't see that we could address all the issues that are being talked about. So anyway, I think there's a little bit more process here. And there was a lot of items on decision point number 1. I don't see how you're going to be able to do that by the next meeting, unless you're going to have 10 meetings, one every day between now and then. So there's a lot of issues there.
No, we're not.
Submit, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
With those comments,
Terry?
is the June timeline, is that realistic? You know,
We'll find out.
We'll find out in June.
What was the question again?
the
I'm sorry.
question is the June timeline realistic, you know, to
Those
get
decision points that were
decision
in
points?
this
Is it
presentation.
realistic?
In my opinion, no.
So I'm not sure if maybe staff or somebody, or maybe Duda can explain that. Is it a realistic timeline?
Thank you, Terry.
Take it in consideration, your comments, you know.
Director Zaragoza, others, members of the board. Yeah, we think it's realistic. I think, Terry does bring up that there is some uncertainty. Much of the concerns about the water budget and those kind of things that we've talked about, a lot of that was an artifact of the fact that the models were in different states of development at the time the preliminary draft was released, and the two of them hadn't been yet to the point where the inflow out of one or the outflow out of one, inflow into the other hadn't quite been resolved yet. That's Cayugas and United have worked a lot to make the models match up in their inflows and outflows, and a lot of those kind of things have been worked out. It's true the models aren't complete yet, or they aren't finished, and we don't have the final documentation yet, and that's one of the challenges of relying on other agencies for the modeling. I think they're doing a great job. They've been really, both agencies, Jill said, have worked extensively with the TAG and staff and the GMA in order to try and share the information that's coming, but they're not quite there yet.
Is it the
They
bullet
think
point,
we are, well, in terms of ultimate development, but let me say in terms of June, what we're trying to get to is we're trying to get to one of the things that a lot of the commenters commented on was they wanted to see a schedule and really understand. Now, the modeling portion of it, we don't have control over, and so that's a kind of an uncertain portion of the timeline moving
that's your
forward.
bullet point states that, yeah.
Right. So, but in terms of coming back in June, trying to solicit some of your board direction on some of these items so that we can move forward with the process of development. If there are certain items that you are not able to have, you feel you don't have enough information to render a decision yet, well, you'll tell us that, and then we'll move on and we'll come back at a later date. I think Director Borchard's idea of having some kind of technical memorandum that will list out the decisions in some of the technical aspects or policy aspects as they may be for your study ahead of that meeting is a good one, and that should help. But I think we should move forward. There's a lot of concern from stakeholders to move forward with getting these GSPs completed so we can move forward into development of replenishment fees, which are so important for moving forward with the projects. They're ultimately going to be needed to minimize the amount of pumping reductions that need to be done. And we understand, I think we need to continue to explain to stakeholders, these are not going to be the definitive plans for time on. They will have to be updated on a 5-year basis. We want to have them as good and as correct as we can have them based on the available knowledge that we have. But we need to, your board's direction to us has been continuously, let's move forward with trying to be expeditious. Obviously, it's taken much longer than was originally started. So that's the idea of coming back.
So you can amend accordingly.
And we can adjust, yes, exactly. Okay. And if we're not ready, if your board's not ready to address all those points in June, then we will adapt.
Can you go back one slide? Okay, I just want to see what the decision points are coming up to have a better idea as we hear people come up to the podium there, what we're going to be asked to do in June. Thank you.
Thank you.
John?
Good afternoon. I'm John Lindquist from United Water Conservation District. United would first like to reiterate that the entirety of the next draft version of the GSPs should be open for public review and comment, including the sections that are considered by some to be substantially complete today. The November 2017 preliminary draft GSPs were missing too much information across multiple sections for any one entity to have conducted a thorough and complete review of any one section. If we don't have the opportunity to comment on the entire document before it's released to DWR, there's an opportunity for us to submit our comments to DWR after the GMA submits it to them, but I think it's more collaborative to get that opportunity to submit comments before that point. The other issue I wanted to comment on, talked a little bit about it. The GMA staff suggests in the agenda packet that the agency should consider conducting a peer review of United's and Callegas's models. And DUDEC has proposed hiring a Stanford University professor who is a modeling expert to conduct the peer review. First, United's modeler, Dr. Jason Sun, and other members of the TAG have reviewed Callegas's model. And although the final documentation hasn't been completed, we've seen enough, we saw the draft version, that we feel it's adequate for its intended purposes and is ready to be put to use. We note that every model has some weaknesses, and everyone here should recognize that all models will be improved over time. So we don't expect the first draft to satisfy everybody, but it'd probably be good enough to get started with. A peer review by a Stanford professor won't hurt, we don't think. We don't know if it's worth delaying the GSP process if we have to wait for that review to be complete before proceeding with the modeling exercises that are on that timeline. And second, United's model has been reviewed by 3 outside modeling experts, which we call our expert panel. 2 of those panelists are internationally recognized as world-class modeling experts. Their final report's nearing completion, and they've been very enthusiastic about the quality of United's model so far. Again, time is running short, so we hope this proposal to have another reviewer of the models won't further delay progress toward completing the GSPs. And perhaps instead, regarding the United model, maybe we could just ask the Stanford expert if our expert panel is qualified to review our model. We think that that person would definitely agree. Thank you.
John, with respect to, obviously we're not there, we're not considering whether or not an independent peer review is necessary, but I can tell you just from experience and training with respect to defending plans like Sigma's, that it's not enough for this agency to rely on your peer review. If we haven't done our own due diligence and satisfied ourselves through an independent process that your work and the work of your contractors is adequate, then anything we do is attackable. And that's more than anything else, even if I had complete confidence in the model and every element of it, personally, as a practicing attorney, I'd still demand an independent peer review.
Our only request that would be conducted in parallel with proceeding on the modeling exercise.
I don't want to hold up any of the process to get any of the other work done. So,
okay, thank you.
Jared?
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board, Jared Bouchard, Pleasant Valley County Water District. We just want to go on record that we agree with the other comments with regard to the public comment period being open for the entirety of the document. We chose not to, which we told your board here, that we were not going to engage experts to review a preliminary draft, so we provided preliminary draft comments on the preliminary draft. So we'd like the opportunity to provide final comments on a final draft, including all of the incomplete sections that were put out. The other thing that sitting here listening to this conversation leads me back to when we had the earlier conversation and the concern about the expenditure of resources and the additional scope that we're asking. This is not your dollars in particular, but it's the payers of the pump fees dollars, and we're expanding scope after scope to re-review information to drive a timeline. At some point we need to put it together in a context that makes sense moving forward so that we're not spending good money over bad just to move a process forward. And listening to the comments here today about what we're going to ask DUDEC to have to go back address all of these comments that were put in here, hopefully, and they will, I'm sure, incorporate those. Then we're going to come back with the secondary comment period, which we're going to have them have to take the time to address those comments again and maybe revise the draft again. So I would just caution you to make sure that we're putting the work in the correct order, or the work product as we move forward, not try and get ahead of ourselves, so that we're spending our money wisely. We've got a great deal of money to be spending around here, and I hope that we're going to spend it in the best manner possible. Thank you.
Jared, before you leave, so are you saying that you do not prefer the concept of releasing the entire document again for a second review?
No, I absolutely.
He wants it.
You do prefer that?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
I would say, just as a matter of process, it would be arguable if the entire document was not opened for comment, that your agency would be at risk of violating some public process as well. It would be like releasing a EIR and saying, hey, we're going to open the public comment period on 2 chapters of it. That's it. Not tell you what the rest of the projects are, anything else going on, receive comment, walk away and say, now you can't comment on the rest of it. I think it has to be opened as a matter of process.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? This too is a receive and file. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Moving on then to item number 7, an update on the new pumping allocation system for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins.
Suppose we wait for the slides to come up. Kim Loeb again, GMA staff for the record. So, as you well know, it's stakeholders have been working for a long time in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins on developing a new pumping allocation system. And in recent times, staff has been involved with working with the stakeholders, trying to come up with a new system. Last year, there were concerns that the stakeholder belt system wasn't going to be ready in time. You asked our staff to come up with an interim system. We came up with a framework for that, and then there was a lot of activity. It looked like the stakeholder developed plan maybe coming to fruition, and in the OPV Ag Owners Group submitted what they called a white paper plan, and much of it was very similar to the framework that we were discussing with OPV stakeholders on an ongoing basis, except for the base period and the allocation reduction. Your board asked for an analysis of that proposal, which we have conducted. It's in your packet. One thing we did take a look at in terms of continuing work on allocations was what were principles for a justifiable allocation system, and we presented some draft principles based on what we'd been hearing from your board over time, and based on feedback, we updated those and tweaked the language a little bit to make sure it aligned with what we were hearing from your board. And so that was in the board pack, and that's where we think we captured what you were articulating to us. In terms of analysis of the draft white paper and the allocation pools, that's already, we've talked about that on an ongoing basis. There was a negotiated agreement in principle for 60% of the groundwater pumping to be ag and 40% to be municipal industrial. The white paper talks about the need to account for surface water as well, and it assumes the past historical 15,000 acre foot a year deliveries from the Santa Clara River, principally to the pumping trough pipeline and Pleasant Valley pipelines. as Director Ranio pointed out at the last meeting, that United does not believe that that's going to be continuing in the future. United's habitat conservation planning effort, they're projecting maybe 12 to 14,000 acre feet a year. There's not been the details of how the surface water allocation tracking would occur. There's been a lot of conceptual discussion, but the actual details of that are still a little bit in flush. In terms of allocation assignment, the agency has traditionally assigned allocation to wells, and this plan looks to assign them to land parcel-based allocation. And, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped there, but in terms of the surface water, it envisions that those operators who receive surface water would assign their allocation to that surface water provider, either Pleasant Valley or United for the pumping trough pipeline. There's not a method for how that would be done. The white paper says that that would be developed with the GMA to try and determine how that would work. A minimum allocation, there's none specified. Some directors have talked about the desire for a minimum allocation. It was not something we had identified in our framework for an interim system. It's not particular or specifically specified in the white paper plan, but it's sort of implemented through their hybrid reduction system, which we'll talk about in a moment. De minimis pumping is not addressed because it's principally addressed agricultural pumping. One of the two items of most contention is the choice of the starting allocation. The white paper proposal is to take the single highest year of 14-15, 15-16, or 16-17. Those are obviously drought year high pumping years. That would tend to favor those pumpers who have highly variable pumping over that time and those who receive surface water. Past base periods that the GMA's looked at have usually been 5 years or more. Oops, I jumped. The allocation reduction method, that's the hybrid. We talked about that last time. There's really there's a couple ways of looking at this. We had been proposing just a proportional reduction down to whatever the sustainable yield is at the end of 20 years. The other school says that the pumping should be distributed on an acre foot per acre basis, and this hybrid reduction sort of splits the middle of that approach. That's another very highly contentious portion of this plan. The ramp down is proposed to be a straight line. Staff agrees with the straight line approach rather than a stepped approach. In terms of flexibility, we've had a lot of discussions about flexibility. You've heard about the banded ramp down or balance sheet method, as it's called in different names. Again, it's proposed in the white paper plan both for carry forward and for borrowing. Staff doesn't have a problem with the concept of the banded approach. Some of the implementation details still need to be worked down. And some of you directors, as well as some stakeholders, have expressed concerns about the borrowing aspect. The white paper doesn't address land conversion or allocation transfers or export prohibitions. In terms of extraction reporting, the white paper proposes that landowners would assign the allocation to parcels and that the GMA would develop a online system so that they could assign it to those parcels, and then operators would assign the would report the assigned parcel allocation or water use to the GMA. This is different from what we've done in the past quite a bit, would require a lot of complexity, but if your board should choose to want to move the allocation to a land-based reporting, then something like this may be required, but that's different from what we have been doing in the past as an agency. There's two variances proposed in the white paper. One was, if land was foul or there were some special circumstances during the base period, there could be a variance process for establishing allocation. That's pretty consistent with past GMA practices. The other was specifically regarding a change from citrus to some other type of crop planting, and wasn't discussed in the white paper itself, but in conversations with the OPV folks afterwards. The specific concern there is the HLB virus spread by the Asian psyllid that should at some point that just become widespread here in the county like it has in Florida, and it just wipes out citrus as a viable crop in that one instance, then there would be an ability for those citrus farmers to move to another crop that would most likely be more water intensive, with the understanding that any increase for that allocation would have to be shared by the others so that it kept the overall pumping at the allocation limit for the basin. And then the replenishment fee, supports and concept. There aren't any details. Of course, we can't really get into the details of replenishment fee until we move forward and adopt the GSPs and submit them to DWR. So that's the analysis of the white paper. We are continuing to have conversations with the OPV ag stakeholders, especially the two divisions over the base period and the ramp down or the method of allocation reduction. We had very good meetings. We had reason to have some cautious optimism that we may get to a resolution over time, but it's very clear it's going to continue to be a long, difficult process, and we're not going to get there in time for the October 1st implementation that we have been looking to achieve. Any questions on that so far before I get into quickly going over the M&I proposal? So we received from the municipal industrial stakeholders a plan for, a letter. There's a draft in the back of the board letter. We're expecting to get a signed copy in the near future. It reaffirms the commitment to a 60-40 split in groundwater. It presumes the starting allocation for the basin as a whole would be at least 100,000 acre-feet a year. The use of surface water or other non-groundwater would not affect the groundwater allocation, and the sub-allocation between the M&I pumpers and the ag pumpers will be handled differently, and the M&I have chosen to propose to continue on the temporary extraction allocation. There'd be a linear reduction to sustainable yield over 20 years. If there's land conversion, it would be proportionately split, the allocation across the land. If there's conversion from ag to M&I, the allocation would accrue to the M&I water service provider and not to the well. They want to see the allocations go to the service providers and not the facilities themselves. And they also would like to see the M&I operators ultimately be able to participate in the water market. They also had some comments on flexibility. They say the M&I would like to have the same flexibility as ag, whatever that is. Pumpers should be able to carry over any unused allocation in the next year, and there shouldn't be caps on that carryover. However, there shouldn't be allowed in a single year more use of the carryover more than that current year's pumping allocation. And they also have indicated they do not believe that borrowing should be allowed as terms of flexibility. So in conclusion, as I stated, there continues to be progress to a compromise plan, at least on the agricultural side. M&I side seems to have come to agreement on what they're proposing, but not in time for implementation on October 1st. It should be pointed out that while we need an allocation system, a way to, as a management action for the GSPs, we don't have to implement a new allocation system to complete these GSPs. We have an allocation system. It is regulating pumping. We recognize that it probably not going to get us to where we need to be at the end of the year or end of the 20-year period, but there's no reason why we don't have to track them on the same track. We can complete the GSPs if the allocation for a new allocation system takes longer and address that in an update. So at this time, we request your guidance on how you want to handle moving forward with allocation. Right now, we have the current ordinance e-allocation reporting through June and July of this year, depending on whether you're an M&I or ag reporter. And so we had talked about moving into a new system or an interim system by October. So we can go back and finish development of an interim plan. We can look at making some meaningful modifications of IAI. We look for direction from your board as to which direction you want to go, so we can come back in June and tell you what we think the plan should be. And we can also look at proposing some reporting requirements to, we are moving with AMI into a monthly reporting. It may make sense to move into a different reporting schedule so that we can, if we do continue on the current reporting periods for allocation, be able to report that extraction, but also be able to report against a water year and a calendar year as well. So that concludes my report, and I look for guidance from you as to whether we want to look at, as we continue to develop, work with stakeholders, develop the long-term new allocation system, look at addressing IAI, or just look at moving into an interim plan.
Thank you, Kim. Questions, comments from the board? You know, one obvious, it seems, approach is that, particularly given the reporting regimen that's in place, is that if we were to continue with IAI, there's basically two things about IAI we know. You know, one is it doesn't work to conserve water or get us to a sustainability goal. And two, if we're going to continue with it, there will have to be a draconian discount off IAI for it to even have a chance of working with a sustainability goal. IAI minus 20 in Emergency Ordinance E didn't work, hasn't worked, for all sorts of reasons, but it hasn't worked. I'd be interested in hearing comments from the board and the public whether how much of a haircut off of the IAI minus 20 would be necessary in order to get us to something that would achieve the beginning of a sustainability plan. Because obviously I don't think IAI minus 20 is enough. If we're not going to move to an interim plan and we want to, for convenience purposes, stick with an IAI approach, I think it's going to need a deep haircut. But I'd be curious to hear comments of the board, the staff, and the public.
Well, Chair West, before you entertain comments from the board on that, I wonder if I could interject. One of the challenges with IAI is that some of the indexes are very tight for crop type and some are loose. And the intention had been, I think, when it was developed, to really go back and take a good look at that. That hasn't happened for a number of reasons, and certainly most recently because we thought we were moving away from it within a period of time. So that's one thing we can look at specifically, but there's a couple other knobs that can be adjusted. One is the total amount of water that's applied to the parcel. There also could be an approach of looking back at what the water was used in a certain period of time for a given COM code. That would be a little bit more challenging to see what, some may have increased use quite a bit and some might not have. One of the biggest challenges is the surface water piece as well, as which you'll hear from growers. But there may be, I think, an across-the-board cut you're right, it's challenging. It has sort of an uneven application to an effect on the growers, and I think that we could get a little bit more nuanced than that, but there's no doubt it's a challenge.
And that's fine. My concern is that the October deadline isn't an artificial one. There is certain reporting and certain planning that will start, come due in the new year. And, this board needs to tell pumpers what to expect, and we can't tell them what to do in October next February. So
right.
we really need to do it sooner rather than later. But with that, again, any questions or comments from the board?
Well, Chair, I would propose it. What do we tell the growers to do, to plan for? We have no goal yet. I mean, that's theoretically the idea of the GSP. I think everyone understands there's going to be a reduction, but to what end goal? The allocation plans currently being thought of and proposed.
Well, think of it this way.
Proposed starting at a current level and then ramping down.
But think of it this way. If Sigma didn't exist, if we weren't busy building a GSP, would we be satisfied with the pumping performance given the existing regulations? Or would we be sitting here saying we're still in overdraft, we're still over pumping, we still need to fix it? Because that's the immediate problem if we're developing an allocation plan separate from the GSP. So I guess that becomes the question. What do we do? And it's not a pleasant question necessarily, not one anybody wants to answer, but independent of GSP planning, what do we do with an allocation system in an overdrafted basin that continues to be an overdraft?
Well, it's an appropriate theoretical exercise. It's an understood situation we have, and yet you can't divorce it from Sigma and GSP planning because we're in it. And so the allocation plans that we have in play, that we have thought about, or that the stakeholders have thought about, think about starting at current pumping and ramping down over 20 years. You're talking about, your words were just a significant haircut. Whether we decided that today or in June or July is quite a big shock to the system.
Well, we can't decide it today. It's not on the agenda anyway. But again, this is an exercise in, staff's asking for direction about what do they start working on. That's all. And we're trying to come up with options for them to work on stuff.
So yeah, that's my difficulty is I think probably most could agree that extraction should be reduced. But in the current environment, does it make sense to cause a significant haircut on current extractions without any guidance as to what that final number ought to be? I think the stakeholders would voice a lot of uproar about that, and we might be in a situation where we cause more damage than moving forward. But it's a good question nevertheless.
I don't have an answer for your question, but I think there's another consideration, and I don't know how long the new interim, Measure E was interim, remember, or Ordinance E. I don't know how long this interim one will be in effect, but surely not as long as the current one. But every time we change, we have significant costs in making the changes with the computer people and all the other stuff. And I think we have to consider that as well, and maybe just get on with getting to the final one instead of another interim one.
Questions or comments?
Okay. Here's where we earn the big bucks. Myself, I've been very vocal about how I've been dissatisfied with our progress and how the agency has been in meeting its mission statement. And that's really what I keep going back to. The mission statement of the organization and why we are here. And as I take a look from when that date was to where we are now, it's a fail. We have not done enough. We have not done enough in working with you, putting the urgency in you, and guiding you, and then implementing. This agency has been a failure. That was what I run on in order to come onto this board, and that's what I'm here about, and that's where my thoughts keep coming back to. With that said, I do want to give the opportunity for the stakeholders to develop a plan and build consensus, and knowing that not everyone's going to be on board. We're going to have stone throwers, and we're going to have grenade tossers that are going to try and blow up whatever we come up with, or whatever you come up with. We've already seen that. I believe that's going to be a continuing theme no matter which plan comes forward. But I want to give the opportunity for that input and that dialogue and that growth process to continue going forward. I do see encouragement with what is being discussed about between out in the Oxnard Plain. And I totally accept the fact that both sides are not going to probably come to 100% consensus. I believe in what was presented and what was put in place by LPUG. And that's not 100% consensus. That's the lawsuit that we have in front of us. But it is a good step going forward, and it bears some fruits. I do think that IAI needs to be tweaked. I do think that that is the most logical plan to leave in place and to make adjustments in order to start going forward. And I do keep in mind that when, in June of last year, when staff presented that a 20% cut to IAI was not a material number as far as what the water was saved, I do believe it is a step in the right direction. I do believe it is a message being set that we are going to keep our foot on your throat in order to make you perform. I'm not happy with it because, like I said, I don't think it's a big enough cut in order to get us where we need to be. But it's one that I would be willing to support in order to get the message out there and get it going. Now, if you want to do 5% every 6 months for 4 consecutive terms, I don't care. It's sending the signal out there that we've got to do something, and status quo is not acceptable. At least it's not as far as I'm at. Our mission statement is to bring the basins into balance and stop seawater intrusion. Cut and dry. We were supposed to have done that by 2010, and we're still missing the goal by a good 30-40%. So for me, the time's run out. We got to do something. And if we're not going to do it this year, what are we doing here? That's the same question I keep asking. And someone give me something other. If we don't do something this year, why do we even exist? How long are we going to continue watching what comes out of the annual reports, seeing the chlorides jump, hearing about water districts with wells going dry, knowing we got in front of us, and we're just going to wait another year and plan some more? I got to get something more out of it than that. Thank you.
John, any other questions or comments from the board? Any from the public?
Jeanette Lombardo, the State Water Task Force Director for California Women for Agriculture. I think what we have to remember is, well, first of all, I actually agree with some of the things you said, Director Aranio, which may be a first. But I think what we need to do is what's happening on the Oxnard Plain is historic. I think it needs to run its course. I don't think it needs to hold up the GSP, as Ken stated. On the other hand, what do? You have to realize when the Irrigation Allowance Index was created, the numbers that were come up with by Dr. Stiles out of Cal Poly dealt with three different factors. One was evaporation, one was frost protection, and one was salinity management. So when we took that 20% haircut, it drastically affected operations. So you may not see it in the conservation numbers or the numbers you were expecting to see, but on a daily operation basis, it affected the growers. So what do we do going forward? We've already heard that there's some crops that the numbers were correct and some perhaps they need to be tightened up. When it was created, how many years ago, it was based upon the science and the research that was done at that time. We have 3 ETO zones. We have some crops growing in all 3. Each are affected differently by the allocation cuts. I think instead of looking at this from a large, holistic, let's just cut straight off the top, we have to look at it more by the crops in the ETO zones. And I know that makes it more complex, but I think for it to be fair, why we wait for the allocations to be completed and save all the stakeholders from going through adjudication process, it might be worth the investment to look into that possibility. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Again, Terry Foreman with TAG. I'm going to state the obvious, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, IEI has nothing to do with the balance of the basin. So it's a tool that can help balance the basin, but it's divorced completely from the basin yield. So you're still going to have to set that number, and then IEI can be a tool to approach that number. But just adjusting the IEI, I mean, you can adjust it down to the point where crops won't grow. So, I assume 20% for some crops would already be getting there. So just ramping down the IEI to 50%, no one's going to plant a crop that if the IEI is 50% because it won't grow. So.
Which takes care of demand.
What's that?
Which does address demand.
Right. They might not grow the crop, but they might, but somebody might just throw water out there and see what happens. But anyway, I just want to make sure that we're talking about, there's sort of two things we're talking about. One is really a tool. The other is the end result. The basin will only allow you to take so much water out before the water levels keep dropping. So.
Martin Gramco, Southland Sod Farms. Wow. So I heard a number of statements that kind of got my hair standing on end. And one of them was
such as it is.
Such as it. I got a cut this morning, literally. Put a foot on your throat. Robert, did you really mean that?
Sorry?
Did you really mean to put a foot on agriculture's throat? I mean,
not agriculture. I'm talking as the stakeholders out there talking. Emergency Ordinance E was put in place, and I was actually borrowing a term from my predecessor when he described it as 2 trains leaving the station and how M&I was going to take a cut and Ag was going to take a cut. In a discussion with him, he literally used that word in order to drive the point home to me that was what the objective was, and that's how he was going to get it. And quote unquote, he was putting his foot on my neck in order to get the basin into balance.
Fair enough. Putting a foot on agriculture's throat is, as I see it, maybe on everybody's throat. What I'm seeing right now with the 60-40 split is that we put the foot on agriculture's throat. The reason is because 60/40 assumed we would get surface water. Now, you've told us in the last meeting, don't expect that, Martin. Okay, then 60/40 is not typically how that water has been split. It's closer to 70/30. In fact, if you look at the recent pumping where there's no 60/40, you see that 70/30 split. So maybe we should be readdressing the 60/40 to a 70/30. That'll take a little pressure and even out the throats that are being stepped on. As to the IAI, that it doesn't work. I mean, I am not excited about the IAI, Eugene. I'm not big about it, but I can tell you that since we have, in the last 3 years, we've, in my company, have actually reduced our pumping. Yet, agriculture hasn't, as a group. So to say IAI hasn't worked, this is going to what Kim pointed out, is that some of us have a pretty tight standard. And turf, by the way, is the standard. It is what all the other crops are measured to. And I'm here to tell you that that's pretty tight. So, you know, while agriculture has essentially gone flat, if you look at the dry years, the last 3, we're off by 16%. So if we're going to adjust the IAI, then we need to be careful about those different crops. Now that's going to create a whole nother set of arguments amongst the constituency here. I do have a concern. I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect on the idea that we have to change. If we're going to continue with IAI, we have to do a 20% reduction next year. Sigma says we're going to do a reduction over 20 years. Yet if we're going to do IAI, we're going to reduce 20% next year. Even your own recommendation said if we continue and we create an allocation plan where people actually get allocations, that we were going to next year have no impact. So next year you start at the top, and now over 20 years, we ramp down. So I'm not getting the connection that says, on one hand, if you do an allocation plan, it's okay. We'll let you slowly ramp down for 20 years. But if you guys can't figure this out, we're going to put our foot on your throat. That's the part. Believe me, we're working on it. Okay, it's not that we're not trying. Yeah, I think that's it. Unless anybody has a question for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Marty. Andy?
Good afternoon, Andy Waters, pumper, LPUG member, LPUG chair. I believe that October 1st date that LPUG has been working on, we came to this board prior to the emergency, and we said we had somewhat of a plan that we could implement before that happened. I think we've worked on that through the emergency, and I know the emergency needs to end someday. I would propose to the board that we move forward with the white paper allocation. If we need to have a true-up period that's longer than we've put together, or if we need to work on longer ramp downs, but I think it's time to move forward with what LPUG's worked on. I know there's litigation that might change our world someday, but until that change comes, I think it's time to move forward, and I believe we're comfortable doing that. If we can hear from somebody else. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Board. Alden Broom, Broom Ranches. I think I agree with a lot of what Martin Gramkow just mentioned relative to the issues with IAI and perhaps the need to start current and ramp slowly down to where we define sustainable yield. In these discussions that we've had with your staff, one of the benefits of getting that GSP out the door is the potential to implement replenishment fees. And I think what we haven't had the conversation, but it's evident in the agricultural community, is we need new water, and we need it sooner rather than later. So we've been in the agricultural community sort of struggling with these different opinions on where allocation should end up. But if that holds up the GSP and replenishment in itself will drive conservation if it's priced accordingly and it brings water in. Because that's a whole other layer of cost, which puts pressure on the user to, if there is any low-hanging fruit or conservation opportunities out there, they're going to reach for it. So I think you need to weigh that. We don't want to disrupt, destroy the vital agricultural economy that we have here. It's unique to the state. It's unique to this country. So, yeah, I think getting the GSP done correctly is important, but in getting replenishment fees started, it opens up a lot more opportunity for ag. Thank you.
Thank you, Alden.
A question just for staff while someone's walking up. That it's my understanding that we can't do really anything about replenishment fees other than have discussions about them until we have a GSP into DWR. Is that correct?
Yes, Director Borchard, that is correct, that we cannot move into that. Our enabling legislation does not allow us to until your board adopts GSP and gets submitted to DWR.
Submitted to DWR or approved by?
No, submitted.
Okay.
Jürgen?
Jürgen Gramco, Southland Sod Farms. I agree with Alden that replenishment fee is going to have a twofold effect. One is that it will drive conservation as an economic matter, and it will provide funds for supplemental water. So we need to get there. Not to blow my own horn, but I was the guy that was up here 3 years ago that said we need to have a replenishment fee, and that was probably the beginning of me becoming odd man out with my peers. But let me give you the odd man out perspective. And Kim's matrix on the issues is right on. It's very accurate state of play. And so I just want to comment on some of the big ones. Surface water. The OPV plan converts historic surface water use into a groundwater allocation. And this occurs because the OPV base period coincides with a period where there was no surface water delivery, while increased pumping made up the difference. Making that higher temporary pumping into a permanent allocation is a consequence that we really need to think through. As to the initial allocation, the OPV base period of 3 years does not reflect any hydrological cycles. I mean, it reflects a drought period, doesn't reflect hydrological cycles, had no surface deliveries, and is one of the driest periods on record. Simply put, it is too short and it's not representative. It's also a period in which Ordinance E was in effect, and the purpose was to cut water use by 20%. Generally, ag stayed flat because surface water was replaced by groundwater. So when you figure that, it looks like pumping went up dramatically, but in fact, applied water use was pretty flat overall in ag. But some of us have a very tight IAI. Turf happens to be that one because, as Marty said, turf is the measure by which all other crops, is a standard by which all other crops are measured, which is to say, turf has an evapotranspiration rate of 1. Other crops have evapotranspiration rates of 40% or 50% or 110% of turf, of that 1. So we are the most studied crop of all crops. Hence, when it was that time when these IAI numbers were created by Dr. Stiles, we didn't have any wiggle room because we didn't have the ability to say, well, wait a minute, that's not right, because there are reams of information for ours. But that doesn't exist for others, and so that's why they ended up being pretty fat. But my point is, we went down 15% during this IAI period. Now if we use that IAI period as the base period to allocate going forward, we get punished for having conserved, while others who haven't don't. And I mean, that is from where I sit, sort of the ultimate insult. I mean, here we are. We've complied. We've lowered our use. And what do? We get that now as our allocation for the next 20 years. And we get to drop another 30% off of that. I mean, that's going to bring grenades, you know. The allocation endpoint, you know, I have real trouble with the idea that dividing water equally by land, as in the Las Posas plan, as in partly by the hybrid plan, is a concept that's consistent with the law. You know, an overlier has a fundamental constitutional right to water for beneficial use, and it's not quantified. So why is lower water use per acre any more beneficial than higher water use per acre? Why wouldn't we use a standard of how much economic value are you creating with each acre foot? I mean, the idea that water should be divided by acre feet is not a concept that I find that's embodied anywhere in the law. And as a matter of fact, there's a Supreme Court decision in the Mojave case that says that the Supreme Court in the Mojave decision held that courts cannot disregard legal water rights in order to apportion water rights on an equitable basis. In other words, you can't take from one person's beneficial use and give it to someone else. And that's what the hybrid plan does. It's also what the Las Posas plan does. So from where I sit, historical use is the best measure of beneficial use. It's also a pretty good measure of what your needs are, so you don't have to mess around with IAI and try to adjust those things in what is going to ultimately be a political environment. I mean, from where I sit, if ag was to be put on the TEA period, just like M&I, and you applied the TEA total to the, applied the individual uses within the TEA and proportionally cut them down, then you'd be consistent with where I think the law is. You'd be consistent with what GMA policy has been in the past. And it's very implementable. You could do it in a heartbeat. So I'm going to put my flak jacket on when I go home.
Thank you, Jürgen. John? Whoops. Jared?
Afternoon, Jared again. This was so much fun. I thought, wow, we're really confusing them. We got everyone up here agreeing from the ag community, and then Jürgen jumped up here. So I'm not going to comment on a lot of what I think we recognize where some of the differences lie between the OPB group and the other minority interests that are being represented. I did want to just clarify or make a comment. I don't, from Pleasant Valley's perspective, and when we talk about surface water, we're really talking about Pleasant Valley and PTP as the main users of that water, have been the beneficiaries of it, and also the ones who have carried the financial burden of bringing that water in. And to categorize it as some allocation that you're shifting from surface water to groundwater based on some based on the fact that there hasn't been surface water the past few years. I can't remember exactly how Mr. Gramco categorized it. I believe is inaccurate. There is GMA resolutions that clearly categorize that water as in lieu water, i.e. water we would have otherwise pumped, but it had basin benefits to why we took those sources of water and paid additional money for it. So I don't want us to get wrapped around the axle on those things and saying that, well, somehow we're transferring surface water for groundwater allocation. Those sources were taken as in lieu sources, and that's demonstratable by historical allocations that are there. So I just wanted to clarify that point that we did. PB does have historical groundwater allocation. It chose to take surface water in lieu of pumping that water, not only for the benefits at PB. I'm not going to sit up here and say that we did it solely to be the greatest people on earth, but There were, historically, it did cost more for PV to take that, and there are other basin-wide benefits, and those basin-wide benefits were on the ratepayers' backs of PV growers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. John?
Good afternoon. John Grether Farming Company, a grower in both the Oxnard and the Las Posas basins. I was a part of the original, what was deemed the grower committee for the formation of the IAI, and we had countless meetings to fine-tune that and work with the GMA staff. At that time, the impression the growers had was that those were tentative numbers, that they would be refined as we went forward, with the understanding that it was an interim plan. The disappointment to me personally is that we're just about to complete the 4th year of the IAI system, and there's been only the first year was completed by the GMA staff. Years 2 and 3 were never finished. There's been no feedback to the grower community as to the correctness of the numbers. There's a wealth of data there. For many reasons, the staff has been tied up with other projects, with the GSP and so forth. There's only so much that all of us can work on as growers and as GMA staff, but the IAI numbers were never fine-tuned the way the grower committee expected that would happen when we got some data feedback. Thank you.
Can you expand on that one for me? This is the first I've heard of this one. Break this down in simple terms for me. So you got a chart of table or a table with the IAI numbers from San Luis Obispo, and you're saying that there was supposed to be some kind of feedback from GMA staff or from us up here in order to tell you whether those are accurate or whether it's real world, or we're seeing numbers that are drastically off from that?
Well, that was the impression. You know, we had meetings with Stuart Stiles.
Okay.
He you know, there was criticism even then that some, as others have pointed out, that some of the numbers were too loose and some numbers were too tight. He was very insistent that the numbers were correct, based on some telemetric measurements that they had done, basing it on sod, as Mr. Gramkow has pointed out. But it was just kind of understood, I think, in the ag community that some of the numbers were soft and some were tight. But as a group, we went with the Stuart Stiles numbers. Some technology has changed, as was mentioned, and of course, the drought exacerbated the pumping during that same time period as the IEA was in effect. So there's room there to make adjustments. We, as farmers, and I think the GMA staff, need some predictability as to what we can expect for the next year and the year after. My understanding is that the Sigma process does not require that the allocation actually be in effect until 2020, and that water year would actually start in October of 2020. So there, I keep hearing the memory of Lynn Maulhart and his analogy of the trains getting to the station and so forth. But we have a timetable that's been established by the Sigma regulations, and that's the timetable we should be working on. As Director Craven pointed out, there's a cost to making a wholesale change for a very short period of time. And that needs to be considered along with the predictability we need to have in the ag community as to how much water we're going to be able to work with in the next year and second year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Any other questions, comments?
Again, John Lindquist from United Water Conservation District. And we noted that the M&I stakeholder group proposal suggests that ag and M&I shall adhere to the same flexibility requirements and that there shall be no cap on carryover accumulation. And we aren't taking sides in this issue, but we do have a couple of observations that we think are relevant. First, water use data indicate that ag and M&I have very different needs regarding flexibility. It's clearly evident that ag water use is 15 to 20% greater in dry years than in wet years, when rainfall and surface water availability reduce the need for supplemental irrigation of their crops. M&I, on the other hand, uses half or more of its water indoors And that need, need doesn't really shift much depending on whether it's raining or not. So United would urge the board to carefully consider the differences in AG's versus M&I's needs for flexibility in their allocations. We see that there would be different needs in order for agriculture and SOAR to have a successful future here on the plain. Also, regarding M&I's suggestion that there be no cap on carryover allocation, United would simply like to caution everyone that in our experience, groundwater can rarely be stored underground forever without some losses over time. And past credit plans have not always worked out exactly as planned.
Just for the record, I want to say that the city of Camarillo's experience has been that the vast majority of our water is not used indoors, it's used outdoors.
Any other questions or comments from the public or from the board?
I have one for staff.
Yes.
And I'll forgive you if you don't know this answer because I've forgotten it myself over the years, but if I remember correctly, one of the main complaints about irrigation efficiency, i.e., was that the numbers of the efficiency were far greater than 1, showing that people were only using maybe 2/3 or up to only half of the water necessary in order to sustain plants. And that was why one of the driving factors we were going to go with IAI and go with more of a science-based approach. Since the years that IAI has been in effect and people have been reporting on it, how close have you seen the typical report being? Is it 70%, 80%, right at 1? Or, whereabouts is this? Are you seeing reports coming in to indicate that there might be some slop in the numbers and that they may need to be adjusted?
Well, I'll start with the last part, and the answer is yes, a definite yes. There's a lot of reporting that is well below 1 for IAI. In terms of what an overall average is, I don't have that for you, but we see a lot of below 0.7, which we understand if it doesn't make a lot of sense. If the index is correct, you shouldn't be able to grow the crop at less than 0.7. But if it's exactly right, I mean, there's obviously some. It's not. There's some other variables, but I mean, it should be as close to 1 as possible if it's most correct. I think what Mr. Grether was saying, that's my understanding of what the original intention was. And so what we have proposed to do, I think also Director Craven is correct that making a significant change to the allocation system in terms of the reporting infrastructure would be problematic. But what we would propose to do if we were to look at that, the IAI, is really look at each crop index and what is the, say what are 80% of the growers reporting for IAI and how much difference is, or do start doing some statistical analyses. It's not simple because within a given report, there might be half a dozen different crops all mixed up, and so it's going to take, it will take some effort to dissect that, and we're looking at that now. But I think in order to continue with IAI, that would be, at least in the interim, that would be the appropriate thing to do, is really look at the individual crops, do some indexes, do some statistical analyses within the crop zones, and see which ones don't look like they're really at where they need to be.
Can you do that year over year for each of the years that IAI has been in place?
Yes, I mean, I think that the first year or so, I think there were certainly a lot of people coming up to speed, and the data may not be as good as what it is now. There's a lot more QC and review by staff that's pretty intensive on these as they come in to make sure that the reporting is correct, at least within the framework of the IAI. And so I would say that the recent data is probably some of the better data, and the early data maybe not quite as good.
Well, to the point that Jeanette was making and that John made, I think that's the place to start as we consider what happens in the next, in the next year is to take a look at that IAI index and see where adjustments can be made and see what an effect that might have on developing the plan. Anybody disagree?
Are you talking in the long term, or are you talking about by next meeting?
Well, I'm talking about initially in the short term. Whether or not it's got long-term implications is something we can evaluate when we see it.
So with that in mind, can you have all that done by next meeting so we could use it to make a decision? I mean, that's...
I would say we're going to take an initial stab at it. I can't stand here and tell you that we're going to have it all done, because we need to work with our IT folks to query the data out and get it. One of the challenges we do have with our system is it doesn't have a real robust, reporting and analysis tools built into it. So depending on the time frame for that. But I do think that we will be able, if we don't have a solid analysis for you by that time, we will be able to have discerned some trends and have give you some indication of whether this looks like it's a successful approach or approach that will be successful.
Well, I am cognizant of staff and how busy they are and what we already have on our plates. And I certainly don't want to load up any more on you and ask you to run around with that. If you do find that this takes more than a little effort, I would ask that you consider maybe an outside consultant, giving them the data and let them crunch the numbers, and you guys do what you're doing. This is an add-on that we've just thrown on you in order to take a look at, and you've got a lot of work ahead of you with the GSP and other stuff that's already going on. So please keep that in mind as far as where I'm at. It is important, but I don't want to just keep throwing stuff on your shoulders and tell you to perform.
Sure. Thanks for that, Director Ranio. That is something that we have considered. We've got to get the data and see what it looks like and be able to really, if we do feel that it's going to take a consultant or some outside help, give them very specific direction. But we'll keep that in mind if it looks like that would be expedient.
Thank you, Kim. This is a receive and file. Is there a motion to receive and file the report?
So moved.
A second? All in favor? All right, okay, moving on now to, let's see, item number 8. Yeah, modification to the AMI tiered incentive program. Arnie?
Chair West, Directors Arnie Anselm, staff to the GMA. Not again. I'll wing it. So I'm going to give you a little background and history on the AMI. It's a little redundant.
You know what? We don't need the history.
Okay.
We get the history at every
We don't have
meeting.
the slide anyway.
Jump ahead to what your request is and why you need it.
Okay.
Yeah.
For a quick, I'll just do right that. When we first set up the tiered incentive for the AMI and joining the water market, it was to incentivize early adoption of AMI so we could front load the installation and to encourage water market participation. When we did that, we assumed, I don't want to call it a worst case, a best case scenario where everybody joined the water market. So all the funds for that higher incentive were calculated to join the water market. As we've got real world data with the applications coming in, not everybody's joining the water market. And in fact, not everybody's eligible to join the water market because if they're in different basins, they're not eligible. Because of that, there's quite a amount of funds that we budgeted for that incentive that we're not able to expend. So the proposal for you in front of you today is to use the unexpended funds and then add them on to where there was no increased incentive for water market participation at a rate of $500 per applicant. Currently, for the first 200 applicants, it was $1,000 extra incentive for joining the water market. We're proposing those unspent funds to go $500 per applicant, and we're estimating that it would be around 230 additional wells would get that incentive.
Okay. Questions or comments from the board?
So moved.
or the public? Any questions or comments from the public? Is there a motion to adopt the proposal?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Need a roll call.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director
All right,
Borchard?
Yes, moving on to item number 9. Authorization for the executive officer to retain special counsel. Is that,
I'll be presenting. Very brief presentation on that, Chair West and board members. As noted, item 9 is a recommendation to authorize the executive officer to retain the Nossaman Law Firm to act as special counsel to the agency at the not to exceed amount of $350,000. Nossaman was selected through a request for proposal process based on their expertise both with regard to groundwater basin adjudications and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. You are also being asked to confirm the conflict waivers that were executed by the executive officer with regard to the City of Ventura and Callegas Municipal Water District as it relates to past and current work that the Nossaman firm is doing for those member agencies. And finally, you are being asked to determine that the services to be provided by Nossaman as special counsel qualify for funding from the revenue generated by the Groundwater Extraction Management Enforcement Surcharge, the so-called GEMS fund, as being above and beyond the normal operating expenses of the agency. And that would be with regard both to the defense of the legal challenge that's been filed against the agency and with regard to SIGMA compliance and the attendant litigation risks.
thank you. Questions from the board? Questions from the public? Is there a motion then to approve the recommended actions? Oh, okay.
We received also a letter from Mr. Goldenring in regards to this issue. Have you had a chance to review that?
Depends on which letter you're asking me.
One that was dropped on us about 5 minutes before the board was put into today's meeting.
And the answer is no.
Okay.
The question then, is there a motion to approve all 3 items of the recommended action?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Keeley?
Counselor, do you want a moment to review that?
I've reviewed it, he doesn't need it.
I got it. Understood.
It resembles an email that I did see, and I'm not concerned. There's no legal basis for this position.
Understood.
Keeley?
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Zaragoza?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Let's see, what do we have? Number 10. Okay, there's no executive officer's report. We do have a closed session scheduled to discuss pending litigation matters. With that, we will temporarily adjourn this meeting pending the conclusion of the closed session, at which point we'll be back. You're all welcome to wait. All right, we are back from recess in open session to report that during closed session, the board voted to authorize agency counsel to proceed to defend the adjudication litigation. Now we're adjourned. Let's see if I can make this phone call.
Is there discussion being moved on the next month's meeting?
Yeah, we're going to have to, we